As we continue looking at scope management, specifically requirements, we're going to go kind of back and forth between the IT upgrade opening case and some real life examples. In the upgrade opening case, the IT department decided some specifications, but who chose those specifications? Who at the IT department chose those requirements? Why this particular configuration and not another configuration? A requirements management plan is a document that explains how requirements will be analyzed and written down and managed. And without that requirements management plan, the scope of the project can kind of get a little off track. And if you don't have a clear system of saying, here's how we're going to collect requirements, here's how we're going to approve them, here's how we're going to make changes to them, then the scope's going to get out of control. An interesting aspect of collecting requirements, though, is that not everything can be quantified. You have to leave some room for intuition and instinct. So if this case were to come your way, if you're managing a project at a company and someone says, boss or project sponsor says, all right, we need you to handle the project, the IT upgrade project. Okay, what are the requirements? What does that project need to do? And you need a plan for figuring out the answer to that. And some of that can be intuition. Maybe you can't quantify everything, but maybe you just kind of know intrinsically there's some elements of this project that would be really good to have. That is part of collecting requirements. This is a picture of what a college computer lab looks like, a typical computer lab in May of 2019. If you were to come by and upgrade this, what would you do? Everyone would have a different idea in terms of what upgrading this means, what the requirements would be. And you have to make sure you have a process for collecting those requirements and deciding on who changes those, who has input to those requirements. There's a lot of different elements in managing requirements that ultimately influence project scope. A requirements management plan is a document that says, here's how we're going to plan, track, and then report requirements. Here's how we're going to perform requirements management activities, how to prioritize requirements. So this is the number one priority, and then these can come afterwards. How to use product metrics, how to trace and capture attributes of requirements. How are you going to do all that stuff? And the requirements management plan is a way for you to put all that in writing. After creating a requirements management plan, though, the next step is actually going about collecting requirements. So you know how you're going to collect requirements. You know how you're going to document the requirements, who's going to approve changes. But when it comes time to figuring out how to collect requirements, that's really tricky. It's all related to scope. You have to start by selecting the right project and then deciding what that project should do. In terms of collecting requirements, it's a lot more expensive to fix software defects later in development. So if you're working on a software project and months down the line you realize, oh no, it should do this instead of this, or in addition to this, you got to go back and recode everything. It's a lot more expensive. This chart from page 206 kind of illustrates this. And it all goes back to the idea of getting this right from the start. If we look at scope versus requirements, scope is big picture, large scale implementation, all the work required to make the project happen. Summarize the project briefly. Requirements are specifically focused on the end result. What exactly should it do? What capabilities does it need to have? When we say upgrade, what does that mean? What conditions need to be met by the product or the end result of the project? So if we go back to the opening case, the scope is upgrade all the workstations, not the servers, just the workstations. And if you were to upgrade everything, maybe that would include the servers. So the scope is deciding what are we doing here? Are we upgrading everything or just some things? And the upgrade is going to include new OS, SSDs, and new monitors. Okay, we know the scope of the project. But in terms of requirements, what should the upgrade do? Are the employees really focused on, do they need performance in Excel? Do they need performance in rendering? What do they need in terms of the upgrade? And that's when you decide it needs to do this, this, and this. The upgrade needs to have SSDs, 512 gigs, dual 21-inch monitors, increase the RAM to 16 gigs across the board. Could the upgrade also mean stand-up desks? Maybe. You need to know these things before continuing with the project. These requirements, you got to get it right. And if we look at Google, Google is not always the greatest. They kind of take this approach of throw a bunch of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. And there's a little pull quote from page 207 where they talk about Google, and it says, employees at Google know that coders are responsible for the quality of their work. They don't rely on testers to ensure quality. Basically, at Google, everyone doing the work takes responsibility for making sure the work is the work that should be done and is done high quality. If we look at an example of Google and requirements management, they've tried a lot of different messaging platforms over the years. Scope and requirements have always been an issue with Google in terms of messaging. For one, there's a lot of areas of Google. I'm not trying to rip on Google here. I'm just saying this is historically what happens. We've got Google Hangouts, Google Wave, if you remember that. Duo and Allo were their video and text chatting messaging platforms. Google Buzz, do you remember that? Google Talk. For years, Google's been trying to figure out messaging. And if we start with requirements, what should the end result do? There's a lot of things that a messaging platform should have, and they haven't really nailed this down. Right now, Google is sort of refocusing everything on one platform, on RCS, Rich Communication Services, which it looks like it's eventually going to replace SMS and MMS. If you use an app like Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or any number of messaging apps, RCS probably isn't going to affect you too much. But for a lot of people who just use plain old text messaging, RCS is going to be the future. And it can do images, video, send read receipts. And Google's trying to coalesce their messaging services around RCS. And RCS does all these things. It hits all their requirements for messaging. It's also unencrypted, which I don't know. It fits Google's platform. They can then read your messages and use that to inform how they send you ads. But Google now has a clear scope goal. They know some clear requirements. If they go with RCS, if they adopt this platform for their messaging, the requirements are basically set already. So now it's going to help them refine scope, because RCS wasn't invented by Google. It's sort of like a common carrier platform that a lot of the carriers are adopting, some slowly, but it's happening. And rather than trying to make their own messaging services, they're going to adopt RCS, and which will likely become the dominant, or at least a very prominent, messaging service over the next decade. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. And a big part of this involves collecting requirements, finding out what should the end result do, and managing those requirements so that we can make sure things stay in line and don't really get out of control. So we'll continue our investigation of requirements and scope in the next video.